Emma Collins never imagined that the price of saving her father's farm would be marrying a wealthy landowner old enough to be her grandfather. On the day she refused him in front of everyone, she believed she had destroyed her family's last hope forever. But hidden among the guests was a young landowner who had witnessed everything, and one unexpected decision from him would change both of their lives forever. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and stay with us for this unforgettable story. A cold autumn wind swept through Willow Creek, Virginia, scattering golden leaves across fading cornfields, while gray clouds drifted low above the quiet valley, carrying the uneasy promise of another difficult winter. For 3 generations, the Collins family had worked the same modest farm, but by the fall of 1894, the land seemed determined to give back nothing. Failed harvests, early frosts, and months of drought had left the fields exhausted. Every fence post and weathered barn carried the weight of a family slowly losing everything they had fought to preserve. Emma Collins, 24, stood on the farmhouse porch, watching the empty fields in silence. She was tall and slender, with long chestnut hair usually tied into a simple braid, thoughtful hazel eyes that rarely missed the truth beneath polite words, and fair skin lightly browned by years beneath the Virginia sun. Quiet by nature yet remarkably strong-willed, Emma had become the heart of the household after her mother's death 7 years earlier. Managing the home, keeping the accounts, and comforting her father had taught her that fear could be hidden, but responsibility never could. Benjamin Collins, 56, emerged slowly from the barn carrying shoulders that seemed older than the rest of him. His once powerful frame had thinned after years of relentless labor, while streaks of gray ran through his dark hair and full beard. Gentle, honest, and respected throughout Willow Creek, Benjamin trusted people too easily. The death of his wife had left him desperate to protect the farm she had loved, even if it meant sacrificing his own happiness. That afternoon, a polished black carriage rolled into the yard. Richard Hawthorne stepped down without waiting for assistance. At 59, the wealthy landowner stood broad and imposing, dressed in an expensive black coat untouched by dust. His silver hair was neatly combed, his trimmed beard immaculate, and his pale blue eyes carried the calm confidence of a man accustomed to owning both land and the futures of those who depended on it. Since losing his wife years before, Richard had become colder, believing that money solved every problem and that everything, including loyalty and marriage, could be negotiated. Benjamin invited him inside with trembling hands. The conversation was painfully brief. Richard laid the unpaid loan papers across the kitchen table before speaking in an even voice. "I'll forgive every dollar you owe," he said, "on one condition: your daughter becomes my wife." Silence settled over the room. Benjamin lowered his head, unable to meet Emma's eyes. Saving the farm meant losing the person he loved most. Emma felt her chest tighten, but her voice remained steady. "I won't marry anyone to pay a debt," she said. "Marriage isn't a business contract." Richard studied her for a long moment before allowing himself a faint, almost amused smile. "You have 3 weeks to reconsider," he replied calmly. "After that, the wedding will proceed." Without another word, he collected his gloves, stepped back into his carriage, and disappeared down the long dirt road, leaving behind a farmhouse filled with silence, shame, and the impossible choice that threatened to destroy the Collins family. The following morning, the Collins farm woke beneath a sky of pale gray clouds, yet the silence that hung over the fields felt heavier than the weather itself. Every passing wagon reminded Benjamin Collins that 3 weeks would disappear far too quickly, and every familiar corner of the farm seemed to ask whether it would soon belong to another man. Near noon, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the quiet. A dark bay carriage stopped outside the farmhouse, and a tall man stepped down with calm, deliberate movements. Daniel Brooks was 33, broad-shouldered and athletic from years spent riding across timberlands rather than sitting behind a desk. Thick dark brown hair rested neatly beneath a felt hat, while a short, well-kept beard framed a square jaw that gave him a naturally resolute appearance. His blue-gray eyes carried an uncommon steadiness, revealing a man who preferred listening before speaking. Though one of the wealthiest landowners in the region, Daniel was known among laborers for remembering names, paying fair wages, and settling disputes without raising his voice. Few people knew that 10 years earlier he had lost his younger sister, Hannah Brooks, after she had agreed to marry a wealthy businessman to rescue their struggling mother from debt. The marriage never happened. Hannah died from pneumonia only weeks before the wedding, but Daniel had never forgiven himself for arriving too late to change her fate. Benjamin welcomed him politely after Daniel explained that he wished to inspect a neighboring tract of woodland which might someday be connected to his expanding lumber business. The explanation sounded perfectly reasonable, yet Daniel's attention wandered less toward the surrounding acreage than toward the worried faces inside the farmhouse. Emma served coffee with practiced composure, although the dark circles beneath her hazel eyes betrayed another sleepless night. She noticed Daniel studying the worn furniture, the patched curtains, and the careful order of a home held together by determination rather than money. "I've heard what happened yesterday," Daniel finally said. Benjamin lowered his eyes in quiet embarrassment. "It isn't a matter I'd willingly discuss," Emma answered before her father could continue. "It isn't shameful to be poor," she said evenly. "What's shameful is believing a daughter should become payment for a loan." Daniel looked directly at her. "If someone offered to help," she interrupted gently but firmly, "I don't want rescue purchased with pity." Her voice remained calm, but every word carried quiet conviction. "I only want the right to choose my own future." Those words struck Daniel harder than she could possibly know. For a moment he was no longer sitting inside the Collins farmhouse, but standing beside Hannah's hospital bed years before, listening to his younger sister whisper that she wished someone had asked what she wanted, instead of deciding for her. Emma's courage was different, yet painfully familiar. When Daniel left the farm that afternoon, he rode directly into Willow Creek instead of returning home. Over the next several days, he quietly visited merchants, farmers, and former tenants who had once borrowed money from Richard Hawthorne. One story became another, then another. Families described losing orchards after a single missed payment. Widows surrendered livestock to satisfy impossible interest. One aging couple admitted through tears that Richard had once suggested their granddaughter could erase the debt by becoming his companion. No law had been broken. Every signature had been voluntary. Every contract had been legal. Yet each agreement had been made when desperation left no real choice. Daniel carefully copied dates, payment records, and witness statements without announcing what he intended to do. 3 days before the scheduled wedding license was to be signed, nearly half the town gathered outside the office of Harold Pierce, Willow Creek's oldest attorney. Harold, a lean 70-year-old lawyer with thinning white hair, round spectacles, and a reputation for meticulous honesty, had handled property contracts for decades. He disliked conflict but disliked injustice even more. Richard Hawthorne arrived first, wearing the quiet confidence of a man expecting another inevitable victory. Benjamin stood beside Emma with visible shame weighing upon his shoulders. Then another carriage rolled into the square. Daniel stepped forward, carrying a leather document case. Without raising his voice, he placed a certified bank draft onto Harold Pierce's desk. "I am purchasing the Collins debt in full," he said. "Principal, accumulated interest, and an additional premium for immediate transfer." Harold examined every page twice before nodding slowly. "The debt is satisfied." Richard's expression hardened. "You've overpaid." "I know," Daniel answered calmly. "Freedom is worth more than the difference." For the first time since arriving in Willow Creek, Richard had no contract left to enforce. The marriage agreement vanished with the debt. Emma was free. Yet as the crowd slowly dispersed, whispers had already begun traveling through the square. Some admired Daniel's generosity. Others quietly wondered why a wealthy young landowner would spend so much money to save an unmarried woman he had only just met. Emma heard every whisper. She knew the debt had ended, but something far more difficult had just begun. Winter settled over Richmond with damp mornings and narrow streets wrapped in pale fog. The city offered more people than Willow Creek, Yet Emma Collins soon discovered that changing places could never outrun a determined rumor. She had accepted her Aunt Margaret's invitation only because Benjamin insisted. He believed distance would give his daughter peace, while he remained behind to restore the neglected farm. Emma reluctantly agreed, hoping a larger city would care little about one farmer's daughter. Margaret Ellis, 52, was Benjamin's older sister. She was a graceful widow with silver blonde hair gathered into a neat bun, warm brown eyes, and a tall, slender figure that still carried quiet elegance despite years of modest living. Gentle but practical, Margaret had survived the loss of her husband to influenza nearly a decade earlier by opening a small boarding house for traveling merchants. She believed dignity was earned through honest work rather than social standing, yet she also understood how quickly gossip could destroy a woman's future. Emma helped prepare meals, balanced household accounts, and assisted the boarders, grateful for work that kept her thoughts occupied. Still, every few days she overheard familiar whispers. "That's the girl. The rich landowner paid for her. I wonder how long she'll keep his attention." The words were never spoken loudly enough to challenge, only softly enough to wound. Emma answered none of them. Several weeks later, Daniel Brooks arrived in Richmond to negotiate timber contracts with local manufacturers. Business genuinely required his presence, but before returning home, he visited Margaret's boarding house. He brought no flowers. He offered no expensive gifts. Instead, he asked Emma whether she believed tenant farmers should receive longer payment periods after poor harvests. She answered without hesitation, "If people spend every season afraid of losing everything, they'll never have enough courage to improve anything." Daniel listened carefully. During later visits, they discussed schools, crop rotation, wages, medical care for workers, and the responsibility carried by those fortunate enough to own large estates. Emma disagreed with him more than once, and Daniel found himself welcoming every disagreement because none of it was spoken to impress him. She challenged ideas instead of titles. The more time they spent together, the more Daniel realized he looked forward to conversations that contained no flattery whatsoever. Meanwhile, Richard Hawthorne refused to accept defeat. Unable to reclaim Emma through law, he chose reputation instead. He quietly informed merchants, church elders, and traveling salesmen that Emma Collins had willingly accepted his proposal before abandoning him when a younger, wealthier landowner appeared. Every retelling grew slightly worse than the last. By the time the stories reached Richmond, many believed Emma had carefully manipulated two wealthy men to escape poverty. One afternoon, Margaret returned from the marketplace unusually quiet. She removed her gloves slowly before speaking. "The rumors have arrived here." Emma lowered her eyes. "I expected they would. You cannot spend your whole life proving strangers wrong. I know, but neither can you let them define you." That evening, Daniel visited once again. For several minutes, they sat beside the fire without speaking. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "I've been thinking." Emma smiled faintly. "That usually means you're about to suggest something impossible." "Perhaps." He folded his hands carefully. "The rumors won't disappear while people believe we're hiding something." Emma looked at him but remained silent. "So I'd like to make you an offer." She waited. "A marriage." She stared at him in disbelief. Daniel continued before she could answer. "A marriage in name only. You would keep complete control of your personal property. Benjamin could live wherever he wished. You would manage your own charitable work, your own finances, and make every decision freely. I would never ask anything of you that you did not choose willingly." Emma studied his face. There was no calculation, no pride, only sincerity. "And why would you do that?" she asked quietly. "Because no decent woman should have her entire future destroyed by a lie." She rose and walked toward the window before answering. "When Richard wanted to marry me, I had no choice." She turned back slowly. "If I marry now simply to escape gossip, then I still have no choice." Daniel nodded once. He understood before she finished. "I've only just escaped one prison," Emma said softly. "I won't walk willingly into another, no matter how kind the jailer may be." Daniel stood. For a brief moment disappointment crossed his face, but respect quickly replaced it. "You deserve the right to refuse," he said. "I won't ever take that from you." He tipped his hat. thanked Margaret for her hospitality, and quietly left. Emma watched him disappear into the snowy evening. For the first time in many months, she realized someone had accepted her answer without trying to change it. Yet, outside the boarding house, the rumors continued, spreading through Richmond, growing louder with every passing day. Spring arrived with clear skies over Willow Creek, and for the first time in months, the fields showed hints of fresh green. The annual county fair drew farmers, merchants, craftsmen, and families from every neighboring town. What should have been a celebration of new beginnings soon became the stage for an old bitterness that refused to die. Emma returned from Richmond only because Benjamin had asked her to attend the fair with him. He believed the town needed to see that his daughter had nothing to hide. Emma accepted, although she knew every familiar street still remembered the rumors. Daniel arrived separately that morning. His expression was calm, but beneath that composure rested weeks of careful preparation. Richard Hawthorne had chosen the perfect moment, standing near the livestock pavilion, surrounded by dozens of respected townspeople. He greeted Emma with exaggerated courtesy before raising his voice just enough for nearby conversations to fade. "It pleases me to see you prospering," Richard said smoothly, "though I confess I never expected gratitude to be rewarded by betrayal." The crowd grew still. Richard continued before anyone could interrupt. "I offered Miss Collins an honorable future. Instead, she discovered a younger gentleman with deeper pockets." A few uncomfortable laughs drifted through the gathering. Emma remained silent. Richard smiled, believing silence meant surrender. Then Daniel stepped forward. "I believe," he said evenly, "that if accusations are made publicly, the truth deserves the same audience." He carried a leather case identical to the one he had used months earlier in the attorney's office. This time it contained far more than loan papers. Daniel carefully removed ledgers, signed contracts, payment records, and sworn witness statements gathered over the previous months. "I've spent this winter speaking with families throughout the county." One by one, names were called. The first to approach was Samuel Turner, a weathered farmer in his early 60s with deeply lined skin, white hair beneath an old work hat, and rough hands shaped by 40 years behind a plow. Quiet by temperament, Samuel rarely spoke before crowds, but losing nearly all his farmland to impossible loan terms had finally overcome his fear. "I borrowed to save my crops," Samuel said steadily. "I paid for 6 years. I still owed more than when I started." Another witness stepped forward. Mary Ellis, a 40-year-old widow with tired blue eyes and simple brown hair pinned beneath a faded bonnet, described selling every cow she owned after her husband's death, only to discover the debt had somehow grown larger instead of smaller. Months later, Richard suggested her 17-year-old niece might improve the arrangement. More voices followed, different stories, the same pattern. Every agreement had carried legal signatures. None had carried genuine freedom. Richard's confidence slowly disappeared. Finally, he raised his chin. "I broke no law." "No," Daniel answered. "You simply learned how to profit from people who had no real choice." Richard looked toward the gathering, expecting support. Instead, he found lowered eyes. Neighbors who had once feared him now stood together. No one stepped forward in his defense. The silence felt heavier than any accusation. Richard turned toward Emma. "So now you'll judge me?" Emma met his eyes without anger. "No." She spoke quietly enough that the crowd leaned closer to hear. "I only believe something very simple." She paused. "Not everything that's legal is right." The words settled across the square with unexpected force. No one applauded, no one shouted. The truth required neither. By the end of the afternoon, people who had remained silent for years began comparing contracts, discussing unfair interest, and offering help to families still trapped by similar debts. Ministers, merchants, and farmers agreed to establish a community lending fund so desperate families would no longer depend upon a single wealthy landowner. Richard understood before sunset that Willow Creek had changed. No court had condemned him, no jury had convicted him, yet the respect upon which his influence depended had vanished. Within weeks, he quietly sold most of his remaining properties and left the county without ceremony. Several evenings later, Daniel asked Emma to walk with him beside the creek that crossed the Collins farm. The water moved peacefully between fresh spring grasses. "I owe you an apology," he said. Emma looked at him with surprise. "For what?" "For asking you to marry me for practical reasons." He smiled faintly. "I thought I was protecting you. You were. But I wasn't being honest with myself." He stopped walking. "I don't want a marriage that exists only to silence gossip anymore." Emma's heartbeat quickened, but she remained silent. Daniel looked directly into her eyes. "I want a home where truth is welcome every day. I want laughter after difficult seasons. I want children who grow up knowing they never have to earn love by sacrificing themselves." He drew a slow breath. "And if that home is ever possible, I hope it's with you." Emma did not answer. She simply stood beside him as the evening sunlight reflected across the quiet water. For the first time, neither of them was thinking about debts, rumors, or obligations. They were thinking about a future neither had expected to imagine. Early summer settled gently over Willow Creek. The fields that had seemed hopeless only months before now swayed beneath warm sunlight, and the old Collins farm slowly returned to life. Fresh fences stood where broken ones had leaned. Young corn reached toward the sky, and for the first time in years, Benjamin Collins walked his land without the weight of fear pressing upon every step. Emma never answered Daniel's confession that evening beside the creek. Instead, she chose something far more important than words. She watched. Over the following weeks, she visited Daniel's properties more than once, sometimes invited, sometimes simply passing through while delivering supplies with her father. Daniel never seemed to notice that she was quietly measuring the kind of man he truly was. She watched him settle a disagreement between two farmhands by listening to both sides before speaking. She watched him forgive a season's rent for a family whose crops had been destroyed by hail rather than demanding payment they could never make. She watched him spend an afternoon repairing a broken wagon beside one of his workers instead of ordering someone else to do it. Most of all, she noticed what he never did. He never mentioned marriage again. He never reminded her of his feelings. He never asked whether she had changed her mind. The freedom he had promised became real because he expected nothing in return. One morning, Benjamin quietly smiled as he watched his daughter reading a ledger Daniel had left for her to review. "I haven't seen you studying figures with that much interest since your mother was alive," he said. Emma closed the book gently. "He asks for my opinion." Benjamin nodded. "And he listens." Those simple words lingered with her throughout the day. Weeks later, a violent summer storm swept across the county. Several tenant families lost barns, livestock, and stored grain. Without waiting for requests, Daniel organized wagons loaded with lumber, food, seed, and tools. Emma volunteered alongside dozens of neighbors. For 3 days she watched Daniel work from sunrise until darkness, carrying beams, lifting fallen fences, comforting frightened children, and refusing every attempt to praise him. Late on the final evening, an elderly farmer quietly thanked him for canceling the family's outstanding debt after the storm. Daniel only smiled. A debt can be repaid. A person's hope cannot. Emma heard the words from several yards away. She realized they had never been spoken for anyone's admiration. They were simply what he believed. A few evenings later, she sent Daniel a handwritten note asking him to meet beneath the great oak tree standing near the highest hill of the Collins farm, the same tree where generations of her family had celebrated harvests, mourned losses, and made promises they intended to keep. Daniel arrived exactly on time. He found Emma waiting beneath the spreading branches as the setting sun covered the fields with soft golden light. For several moments neither spoke. Finally, Emma broke the silence. "When Richard wanted to marry me, I felt like I belonged to everyone except myself." Daniel remained quiet. "When you asked me to marry you in Richmond," she smiled gently, "I said no because I was still making decisions out of fear." She stepped closer. "I don't want fear choosing my future anymore." Daniel looked at her, hardly daring to hope. "If I ever become someone's wife," Emma continued, "I want it to be because my heart has already chosen before my words do." She reached out and took his hand. It has. For the first time since they had met, Daniel struggled to find an answer. He slowly lowered himself onto one knee, not because custom required it, but because respect did. "There are no contracts this time," he said quietly. "No debts, no bargains, no conditions. If one day you disagree with me, I hope you'll tell me. If one day you choose differently, I'll still respect the freedom that made me love you." He smiled. "Emma Collins, will you marry me?" Tears gathered in her hazel eyes, but this time they came without sorrow. "Yes," she whispered. "This time because I choose you." Their wedding took place a month later on the Collins farm beneath the same old oak tree. There were no extravagant decorations, no famous guests, and no grand speeches. Farmers, neighbors, former workers, and families Daniel had once helped stood together to celebrate two people who had earned happiness through honesty rather than wealth. Years passed. The farm prospered once more, while Daniel and Emma became known throughout the county for treating every worker with fairness and every struggling family with dignity. One autumn afternoon, a traveling merchant asked Daniel why a wealthy landowner had chosen a woman who had once been mocked by nearly the entire county. Daniel looked toward Emma, who was laughing with several children beneath the old oak tree. Then he answered with the same quiet certainty that had always guided him. "Because she was the first person I ever met who would rather lose everything than lose her self-respect. A woman like that deserves to be loved with respect, never with pity." Emma heard every word. She smiled, and after all they had endured, she knew she had never truly been rescued by another person. She had been saved the day she refused to surrender the right to choose her own life. Thank you for spending your time with this story. Perhaps most of us will never face the exact choices Emma and Daniel did. But in everyday life, we all meet moments when we must decide whether to follow fear or remain true to who we are. Sometimes the greatest act of kindness is not rescuing someone, but respecting their freedom to choose. And sometimes the people who quietly change our lives are simply those who listen, tell the truth with compassion, and stay when life becomes difficult. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments where you're watching from and tell us which moment stayed with you the most. If you believe stories like this deserve to reach more people, please like this video, share it with someone you care about, and subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories of courage, kindness, and hope. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, good health, wisdom, and countless moments of quiet joy. Thank you for being here, and until our next story, may His grace walk beside you wherever life leads.